his journey going back before the beginning, and then before that with Jordan Peterson. And as a part of that, I kind of who introduced talking about Kierkegaard with Paul on a couple of occasions, actually, I think. And I think that's at least one part of how this got kind of started. But before that, people who watch this kind of maybe know a little of this, but I'm a physician. I'm an older guy compared to the rest of the kind of gang in this corner of the internet, as it's been referred to. And I'm a physician, but I have this interest in all things intellectual, but also things touching on Christian themes. And that's been a part of my life forever. And because of that, I think it became a part of my son's life, Kevin. And a part of that was a kind of journey with Kierkegaard. I first read Kierkegaard in college, but then I got interested in it in a many years ago, 15 years ago at least, a guy named Hubert Dreyfus, who was doing a kind of, culture and philosophy and film kind of course that he teaches out at Berkeley, or used to teach out at Berkeley. And as a part of that, he talked about fear and trembling. And that brought me back to my college days and a deep dive into film. And so I really kind of dove into it at that point. And so I had this thing of Kierkegaard and fear and trembling in the back of my mind as I was reading other stuff in the intervening years. And at some point, Kevin and his maturing in college and a friend of his were kind of intellectually inclined and were investigating some things. And I introduced the idea of Kierkegaard to them, and then they kind of dove into it from their own perspective. And Kev is a kind of a poetic guy, a writer of music, performer of music, and he's integrated kind of what I would call thoughtful poetry into his musical lyrics and the band that he's a part of. And this friend that I was referring to is a part of that band as well, and he's also a poet. And so Kierkegaard kind of was a natural fit there, as well as other things, T.S. Eliot and some other things that we all love talking about. And that's how Kevin, I think, turns into this conversation a little bit. And I mentioned something I talked about the last time, which is that he has one song in his new suite of songs with his band that's called Afraid and Trembling, which is basically, well, I'll let him talk about that, but it's a direct connection from Fear and Trembling to his music. So, and Kev's now graduated from college and doing other things, gonna be going to school for other things beyond college, and has always kept his interest in ideas and poetry and music. So that's Kev.
Right. Kevin, are you going to say a few introductions, or has he covered you?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess one thing that's unique to my story that I feel like I always have to share is, not to make this about my own experience, but I had a mystical encounter when I was very young. And my journey into Christianity has always been how can I see what I encountered or my experience in the form and language and symbolism of this religion. And so, a lot of what I've encountered God has been a very intimate and personal thing. And I think Kierkegaard has kind of affirmed that side of it and ultimately opened up the religion of Christianity to be a vehicle for encountering this kind of mysterious, deeply personal presence that I consider God to be, if I can even really speak about it. So, I love Fear and Trembling. No, that's my main kind of work of his that I've explored. Also read Sickness Unto Death, and I listened to your guys' conversations about that as well.
Yeah, I can definitely see how Kierkegaard could help you there. He's definitely got that side to him. Jarrod? He's just moving his chair. I can introduce Jarrod a bit. It's a bit of an interesting story how I came across Jarrod online, and it sort of fits. It's a really good segue into the conversation topic I wanted to explore today. So I think I first came across Jarrod on Esther O'Reilly's blog, and she
Yes.
had this she had this article on Christian apologetics. What was it called, Jarrod? Do you have an idea?
I don't recall. I can find it real quick.
Yeah, it was called something like why apologetics is good or something, and she had this apologetic for apologetics, and Jarrod got triggered by that piece, and he weighed in on the comments, and he had this really good exchange going with Esther, and Esther wasn't agreeing with anything he was saying, and I came across his exchange, and I was like, whoa, this guy Jarrod and we're on the same page. I should reach out to him and get him to see what he thinks about my blog on Kierkegaard. So I just sent him a link on one of my pieces, and then he just read my piece, enjoyed what I had to say, and then wrote me like this long reply. And now we've been corresponding through the blog and through email, just sending these long emails back and forth. And he's got a pretty interesting background. I'm not sure if he wants to share that here, but he's a really interesting fellow.
Yeah, whatever's relevant, it's up to you guys. I believe has Christian apologetics failed?
Yeah, that was the piece.
Yeah, or if that's not it, that's one of her more recent ones. But
yeah, I think that was
no,
the piece.
the answer is yes. By the way.
Hopefully.
Agree.
Let me see. Okay.
Hey, Jarrod. So fill
Yes.
me in on that. What? Because I like Esther a lot. She and I talked on one of the comment streams because she picked up on Elliot. She's one smart cookie, I'll tell you. And we went back and forth about Four Quartet, which is kind of my favorite poem of all time. And she also had a dissertation or a report or some sort that she had written earlier on Four Quartets, which I found very fascinating and had a depth to understanding it that even, well, it was more than me, and which surprised me a little bit. Not that I'm a scholar of it, but I've been thinking about T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets for a long time, and she just new things. So anyway, I love Esther, but so I'm interested in Jarrod. What was your point about?
Yeah, and I'm actually reading over my comments then to see if I can remember what it was I said then. But yeah, I mean, I find her very bright as well. She's obviously knows her apologetics. I kind of came from that world. I had sympathy for apologetics for quite a while, but there's no personhood in it. I sort of feel like if Esther succeeds in her project, she's described this abstract thing that nobody should really care about. If you're interested in what the fact is, if you want to know what Christianity is as a matter of history, if that's your only concern, she perhaps can do that. I mean, we can get into the arguments to find out, to what degree they have merit. But ultimately, if she succeeds, what is a person supposed to do about that? Being a Christian isn't a matter of memorizing a set of doctrines, and certainly not memorizing some apologetic methodology, which she seems to be selling more stridently than apologetics itself. It seems to me that there's not only a doctrine that you have to subscribe to, but there's a particular way in which you have to subscribe to that doctrine, and Christianity is apparently captured in that project. And I just don't find anything in that project to be appealing in any sense.
And if I can add something to that, I think what I often find with apologists is they end up by trying to argue Christianity in a sense from without, or they're sort of taking this outside perspective and sort of looking at Christianity through a microscope. And in the process of sort of looking at trying to prove Christianity from outside of Christianity, I think they end up distorting it, and the version of Christianity they end up with is a distorted version of what it looks from the inside. And I think a good example is the idea of God that apologetics comes up with. So Christianity gives you this picture of God who's become man and has gone to the point of the cross. So the picture of God that Christianity gives you is a God crucified. And there's no way you can ever get to that God from outside. The best you can do is to have sort of this abstract deistic person sort of hovering over the machine that is the universe, and sort of tinkering away, and then maybe sometimes intervening to fix some of the cogs on the machine. But it's such a radically different picture of who the God Christians claim to worship as. So that's one of the objections I would have as well.
And if I can jump in, actually going through the comments now, the article was essentially comparing the traditional apologetic methodology to Jordan Peterson, and kind of noting the irony that Jordan Peterson himself, not a Christian, is arguably doing more to shepherd young seekers into the church than the apologist does, and I was sort of agreeing with that. With that idea. That's exactly what I see, and I think there are good reasons why that's the case.
Yeah, I attended a Nazarene school at college, and a lot of my friends, even though I studied chemistry, were kind of straight, I guess, creationists, so very fundamental in their belief about the Bible and what it told us. And in fact, my advisor, who was a chemist who studied at Berkeley, was a creationist, so it's kind of a fascinating world to live within. But nonetheless, what I found, I guess, in that conversation that was interesting to me was creationists had kind of adopted the same worldview as the evolutionary scientists. And so this world that was kind of based on or worshipped rationality was being kind of simultaneously rejected and yet assumed by the creationists. They thought that in order to believe in God, they needed to worship reasoning. And so in general, the reason I have an issue with apologetics is because then God is no longer God. God is subservient to reasoning, to rationality.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And so as soon as you think that God requires validation, then you have no longer worshiped God as Almighty. And so the tradition of Judaism, where God is ineffable, Yahweh is a living presence, it can't be mediated through rationality. It's a direct encounter always. And so I think the project of apologetics is really just a worship of rationality, not a worship of, I guess, an intimate awareness or presence that is who I have come to find God to be.
That is such a good point. Yeah, I think this point about sort of reducing God to the God you can understand is so key here. I've become interested in Barth recently, but I haven't managed to pick up any of his books. But he sort of, has this idea of God as wholly other. And what he's trying to get at there is that you can never sort of get at who God is from reason or from, what Esther would call the natural light. You sort of God has to come down and and sort of reveal himself to you. And then there's this other theologian I like, Stanley Hauerwas. He has this great line where he says, God is God and you are not. And I think that's the posture that I think apologetics misses a lot, especially in the worst form, where essentially your conception of God becomes equivalent with God. And if your conception of God or your conception of Christianity, your conception of the universe becomes disproven or comes under threat, then you can no longer sustain belief in God. So apologetics, in my mind, is often driven by fear because the God apologists believe in is simply too small
and fragile. I agree with that one point that you went over there, is that once you're in that mode, then the whole construct has to fit together perfectly. And any little missing piece, it's kind of like a house of cards. I mean, it may look like it's all solid, but then if one piece doesn't fit, then the whole thing is at risk. And so I agree with you. I think apologetics it's a kind of discourse that has as a presumption a kind of worry that the whole thing needs this rational construct, or else it's going to fail. And so whenever I hear a Frank Turek or a kind of a real strident apologist, what I kind of feeling is a kind of a kind of pity, but a pity in a positive sense, a kind of compassion for the person, because it seems to me that it implies a kind of worry that they have, or anxiety that they have about the very thing that they're so stridently defending.
Desperation is a word that sometimes comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, Julian, what you were talking about reminded me of Kierkegaard's elevation of the subjective over the objective, or the ethic. And so anything that can be talked about is in the ethical. It can be validated by agreement. And that is ultimately what rationality is it's an agreed upon, validated social construct, a concept of God. And ultimately, the subjective is this unspeakable, direct encounter. And I think what's so beautiful about the Bible for me is that if we worship Christ crucified in promoting that idea, we're saying that God is absurd. Like,
yeah,
there is no validation for God, because God died on a cross. If you get yourself in the mindset of someone in that era, God was by definition power in the world. God was the same as that which had force to act. So whether it was Poseidon, the ocean, or something else, to think of God as weak or meek or dying is essentially to say God is not seeking validation from you. He's not trying to prove himself. God is quiet. God is the lily of the field, to kind of quote another Kierkegaardian analogy.
In the core, you might call it conceit of apologetics, is that the perfectly rational person should ascend to apologetic arguments insofar as they're true. And if you think about it, that entire process is somewhat slavish. It's somewhat mechanical. There's no. You brought up the point about Kierkegaard's dichotomy, well, not quite dichotomy, but functionally between the subjective and the objective. Apologetics strips the subjective out. There's no realm of commitment. There's no realm of autonomous engagement. I ascend to apologetics because that's what my mind does in response to these arguments, and that's considered success in the apologetic world. You haven't even begun to engage with these concepts as a person, to wrestle with them, to form a relationship with with, you might call it, object of these arguments, which is ultimately the creator of the universe, a person.
Yes, that's a really good point. And it introduces something I've been studying a little bit more recently, which is David Bentley Hart. And he's got a thesis that I really like in this area, because he regards this objective notion that you're talking about, Jarrod, and this argument as constraining, as he calls that dialectic, a dialectic argument. And he says that we need to move, and I think he argues pretty convincingly away from this notion of dialectic, which he actually, in the kind of classic David Bentley Hart way, describes that as violence. It's kind of a kind of idea-based violence, because you're constraining the listener, if you will, or the person trying to imbibe this apologetic dialectic. And he wants to argue that we should replace that with a notion that we assent to, we come to a true faith or belief in Christianity in a different mode. And he says that mode is aesthetic. Now, this is aesthetic, not, I don't think, in a Kierkegaardian sense, but aesthetic in the sense of it's a rhetorical argument. That is to say, it's an argument that's appealing based on essentially beauty or the way in which you would come to choose something that is more beautiful than something else, rather than something that's a constraining argument. I really kind of like that way of framing the notion that arguments are fraught with that kind of violence as its core, and that we need to move more towards this notion of aesthetic.
I think
yes, and Kierkegaard comments on this as a form of seduction. So the idea is to bring somebody along into your project, is to convince them to commit to this as a matter of their own volition, which is like just like you were saying, which is the opposite of the apologetic project that brings you on board involuntarily as a form of assent to the arguments, rational assent to the arguments.
I think, that's right, Jarrod. Kierkegaard sort of tries to seduce his readers. I was thinking about what you're describing, Jim, the other day, and I was thinking about, what is the difference between, maybe a sort of the approach someone like me is trying to have towards Christianity, or maybe someone like Kierkegaard and the apologist. And, the sort of facile dichotomy I came down to is the apologist is looking for the right facts to subscribe to, and I'm sort of looking for the most beautiful thing or something like that. It's sort of like my approach to Christianity is one of looking for beauty, and it seems like the apologist is just looking for the facts. And you so often see this, especially with regards to sort of the arguments for against theodicy. You'll see sort of something like the apologist saying, God is this absolute will, and he wills that these people suffer unendingly, that these people suffer in this way. And, that's just a brute fact, and you can agree with that or you cannot agree with that, but that's the truth. That's the cold, ugly truth. And it seems like so much of the apologist arguments are unsatisfying in that way, because they claim that the view they're presenting is true, that this is the facts, that this is substantiated by the arguments. But what gets held up is just an ugly view of reality and an ugly view of God in many cases.
And actually, theodicy is kind of an interesting point to bring there when you consider the intrinsic and inherent subjectivity of God. I mean, if you have a spouse and you were to say it's the nature of my spouse that they're always abusing me, you can't. What does it say to speak of that as an objective fact? They're not an objective person. There's some form. There's relationality there. You're not talking about an objective fact of the universe. So to bring up a theodical argument as if it encompasses the entire realm of suffering is to depersonalize God. Absolutely. And so it seems to me that project doesn't even get off the ground.
Yeah. Anything to add there, guys? I could read a quote from Kierkegaard just to turn things back to Kierkegaard. I could. So here's a quote from Concluding on Scientific Postscript, where he defines truth. I'm not sure how well this will fit in with what we've just been describing, but maybe it will. Hold on. When subjectivity is the truth, the conceptual determination of the truth must also include an expression for the antithesis to objectivity, a memento of the fork in the road where the way swings off. This expression will at the same time serve as an indication of the tension of the subjective inwardness. Here is such a definition of truth. An objective uncertainty held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness is the truth, the highest truth attainable for an existing individual. At the point where the way swings off, and where this cannot be specified objectively, since it is a matter of subjectivity, there objective knowledge is placed in abeyance. Thus, the subject merely has, objectively, the uncertainty, but it is this which precisely increases the tension of that infinite passion which constitutes his inwardness. The truth is precisely the venture which chooses an objective uncertainty with the passion of the infinite. I think we'll leave it at there. Can anyone tell me what he's getting at there?
Well, yeah, you've got the Kierkegaard said in one lecture, I believe, leave science to the scientists or something to that effect. He recognizes objective facts are objective. He has no problem with the inherent nature of objectivity. He has a problem with the attempt to totalize objectivity, as the scientific materialists do, as Hegel did. His entire project exists in this realm of objective uncertainty. So in the realm of ethics, in the realm of religion, in the realm of interpersonal relationship, all of these areas that cannot be captured by the objective scientific method, that's where his entire philosophy is. And that's where subjectivity is brought to the fore. And intrinsic in being a person is moving into the future. It's moving into this realm of uncertainty. The objective is temporal. It's confined to the temporal, and the nature of being a person is such that there can never be any set of facts that you have to subscribe to as a matter of logic. You're in a sense going on this journey, and intrinsic in any journey, at the beginning of any journey, is the choice to go on the journey. It's the choice to invoke your passion and make the commitment to move into this project. And for Kierkegaard, existence is the center of everything. Everything that matters starts with existence. Objectivity has its place, but ultimately objectivity is completely depersonal. It has nothing to do with a person's life and the nature of living. So this entire notion of truth in all of the realms that it matters to the person, the religious, the ethical, etc., it's a matter of passion, it's a matter of commitment, it's a matter of engagement.
I like the journey motif there, and that was part of Julian and Robert's conversation the last time was this kind of narrative notion of the subjective experience, and how we're all on this arc of a journey, and that brings you always back to your subjective experience of that, and you face a future that will play itself out in only the subjective way. That is saying, only you own that very personally and very individually, and that makes subjectivity primary by necessity in terms of our very experience.
Yeah. What do you think? I'm always a bit confused what he's getting at with what he says. An objective uncertainty held fast in the appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness is the truth. So how does sort of passion fit into this notion of, existence as this journey into the uncertain? What do you think he's getting at with passion here?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what that quote is saying, that's for sure. But I think the thing I'm inspired to say is that we live in a world that seems to be very much designed by a certain level of uncertainty. And so just to speak personally about what Kierkegaard has kind of helped me come to terms with is, you look around the world and you're like, well, birth is a very mysterious process. What place I was born into, the people, the language, etc., economic status. Death is mysterious. It's nearly impossible to predict when, where, how, or frankly, like the essence of death, which is complete uncertainty, almost just by definition. And then even the important things that happen in our lives, like the people we meet who we will marry, or friends or business relations, they spontaneously occur. Once they happen, we can steward and kind of incorporate those things. But in general, our lives as human beings are characterized by uncertainty. And so if the apologetic kind of project is to eliminate uncertainty, then we're just inevitably going to be alienated from our experience. And we're going to think of God as a failure subconsciously, because ultimately the apologetic project has failed. On the other hand, if we can see uncertainty as somehow the doorway into subjectivity, like, I mean, the fact that I don't know everything is actually like the other half of my subjective experience. I get to explore. I mean, a relationship would be dead in the water if I knew everything there was to know about someone. And so Kierkegaard kind of elevates this uncertainty and sees it as actually a guideline, almost like a designed-in feature of the universe to awaken us into our subjectivity. And so faith is not seen as like a means to an alternative end of achieving some objective thing, but instead the aim is actually designed to put us in a posture of faith and ultimately awakening us to the correct experience. And so incorporating uncertainty and seeing that as actually by design what God's intention was, the only way I've been able to not feel completely alienated in my daily life, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and a lot of good points. This entire conversation of subjective truth in Kierkegaard takes place, I believe, in this realm of objective uncertainty. So what he's saying is that there are plenty of things you can be objectively certain about. That's the scientific realm. But everything we're talking about here is in the realm of things you cannot be objectively certain about, and that's the realm of the individual. Mm-hmm. And individuals are not. There are scientific facts about individuals, but being an individual itself is not a scientific fact. And the nature of the individual, the nature of the person, is that they are constantly in flux, constantly changing. So every day, every moment is a new experience, and there's no fact that can be said about an experience that you haven't yet had and you know is going to be different in the future. So what you're doing is making a commitment. And that's where the passion comes in. Because it's very easy to disengage from this project, and Kierkegaard implies in Fear and Trembling that many people, quite frankly, do disengage from this project. But to the extent that you're going to engage with the project of being a person, that necessitates passion.
In a conversation Jarrod and I had a few weeks ago over email, he made the point that Kierkegaard sees Christianity as, fundamentally an existential, sort of a mode of existence, or I'm not sure what the language you used was, Jarrod. Could you?
I believe I said a state of being. So it's not a fact. It's not something attained to the universe. It's a way of being a person. It's a way of living your life. It's a way of engaging with reality.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is this conception of Christianity that Kierkegaard has about it fundamentally being about this lived existence is what leads to one of the central arguments he makes against apologetics. And this makes me think about something Jim said last week about, how Kierkegaard actually sort of made Christianity in this sense something real, tangible, connected to your existence, something you can be passionately engaged with to you. And I think that's what's behind a lot of Kierkegaard's attacks on apologetics, is that it fundamentally takes this experiential, existential nature of Christianity and then says, this is something that we actually have to, from the beginning, put on the side and then engage with Christianity objectively. And to Kierkegaard, that's a fundamental misunderstanding, a fundamental, sort of turning in the opposite direction. And then if I can read one of my favorite quotes here from, this is the book I started with Kierkegaard, Concluding on Scientific Postscripts. Amazing book. I just learned so much from it. But he has this, he has all of these, sort of describes these characters who are doing something. So there's, for example, he has this almost parable of a guy who goes to the deer park for the afternoon, and then he has a whole narrative about that. And here he has a man who wishes to acquire faith. Then he says, suppose a man who wishes to acquire faith. Let the comedy begin. He wishes to have faith, but he wishes also to safeguard himself by means of an objective inquiry and its approximation process. What happens? With the help of the approximation process, the absurd becomes something different. It becomes probable. It becomes increasingly probable. It becomes extremely and emphatically probable. Now he is ready to believe it, and he ventures to claim for himself that he does not believe as shoemakers and tailors and simple folk believe, but only after long deliberation. Now he is ready to believe it, and lo, now it has become precisely impossible to believe it. Anything that is almost probable or extremely and emphatically probable is something he can almost know, or as good as know, or extremely and emphatically almost know, but it is impossible to believe, for the absurd is the object of faith, and the only object that can be believed.
I like that. And Jarrod, your comments, those are right on point. I follow you exactly there.
And you might also want to ask, when you've gotten to the point where something is so probable you can't help but believe it, you believe it as a matter of necessity, you might then ask, what is it that's believing it? Because I could write a program that responds necessarily to some algorithm. It's not quite a person that's believing it. You've depersonalized the entire process of ascending truth, and that's fine if the truth that you're ascending to isn't intrinsically personal. If you're recognizing a fact of reality, the color of a chair, etc., but it's definitely not the realm of marriage. It's not the realm of religion. It's not the realm of ethics. All of these things that require intense personal engagement. When you reduce these to facts, you've reduced the subjectivity from them. You've depersonalized them completely. You might as well make a machine that follows this project, because it's definitely not a human project anymore.
This makes me think of the mode of a kind of a lecture, and how far we've gone with someone standing up before us and making kind of presenting a set of ideas, and the mode that you are in when you're sitting in that listening. There's a kind of normative demand on you to assent to what is being given to you, and so we've gotten so used to being in that mode of discourse where what's being delivered to us is placing us in this posture of normative of demand, where we either see it as constraining and we assent to it, or we maybe even dissent from it, or we detract from it. But in the end, the mode of discourse is just constraining in that way, and it doesn't leave open some other way of discourse or other way of engagement. And it's one of the things that I've contrasted with that is a poetic mode of discourse or a musical mode of discourse in which it's, it's participatory, to use the overused term recently in this corner of the internet, but it's being involved, it's going along with, rather than, kind of being in this mode of constraining kind of logic. And it would seem that other modes of Christian engagement, besides this kind of notion, well, I think apologetics are the extreme version of it, but perhaps a lot of sermons are this way of engagement as well. And it seems to me this is one of the reasons why I have a sympathy for the new orthodoxy or the new liturgistic sacramental mode of Christianity, because it's more living it, it's more being in it, rather than thinking it through.
And if I can add something here, I've recently, Jarrod and I were also talking about this. In a recent post I wrote, I was thinking about the relationship between Christianity and power, and especially and near the end also the relationship between apologetics and power. And I think modernity, if I can use that word in a sort of very loose, broad sense, is intimately connected with control. And the way I think about it is this way. So around the Enlightenment, you sort of have a new class of elites developing, where it's now the people, it's the well-educated, the scientists, who are now the people who sort of hold power and sway in society. And rationality in that context becomes a discourse of control. If you want to be really cynical, I think what often happens in our rational debates is it essentially becomes a proxy for the political battles that are playing out. So essentially, if you can win the rational argument, if you can have the most rational worldview, you gain the right to mold society into your own image. And you really see this in the new atheist / apologetics debates, and Paul Vanderklay often makes this point, where it's essentially a political argument, where you sort of, he always cites this example of Richard Dawkins and Unbelievable talking with two more liberal Christians, and then Dawkins makes the point, I don't really care about you guys. I'm more interested in I'm more unhappy with the fundamentalists who want to sort of push their values onto society. And so what I see is that so often behind these rational arguments is sort of a quest for power and political dominance. And now I wonder if, maybe I think for this reason that pure rationality is insufficient. You have to combine it with beauty, I think. Because if you're just running on rationality, it's so easy. It just becomes all about power. I think it has that tendency to slide into power. So I wonder if maybe beauty is one mode of constraint or one way of finding truth that sort of corrects for that tendency. I'm just throwing this out there. I wonder if you guys think I'm making
real quick
sense.
That's the point I think that David Bentley Hart's trying to make in his big elaborate way, but that's, I think, exactly his point.
I think that it's not really about, so I didn't talk before, I have a couple babies at home and they're very loud, so I don't think it's really about rationality. Is never really about rationality. So there's like You mentioned the new atheists, and they tout rationality as, as it's their calling card. It's what they're all about, apparently, but it's not really, because you can't be just about rationality. Rationality is just a tool. Rationality is used to get somewhere.
Yeah.
I read this book for university by a couple of guys from the Frankfurt School, the dreaded Frankfurt School, and they concluded, or they basically made this argument that it was rationality itself that was somehow the problem, or that it's called the dialectic of enlightenment, and it basically traces the genesis of the Nazis in some way. They're trying to make sense of it. I think their conclusions are wrong, but because they make too much of rationality itself. It's just used as an excuse. So you have a rational debate nowadays, and you have two guys, and they're both trying to be super rational. But what they're really about, like you mentioned, is power or something like that, and power conceived of in a particular way. So for the Nazis, what they were trying to attain was, of course, power, but it was their version of power. It was the subjugation of those that would, diversify the gene pool in a way that they saw as negative. Or for the communists, was power conceived of as, the subjugation of those that would upend a state that was conceived of as the end all and be all, the state to end all states, or something like that, right? I guess my point straightforwardly is that rationality is always a cover. It's always or a tool, a way to get somewhere, not an end in itself. It's always a when someone claims to be rational, they're hiding behind it often, if that makes sense.
I think that's a
short point.
No.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I've noticed in certain circles, just the language of logic, rationality, etc., is so often a rhetorical tool, where people are saying, "I'm rational, I'm logical, I have the facts," and often this is just a way to, to say, you should listen to me, you should give me power, and it's more of a rhetorical tool than an actual argument, I guess.
Yeah, and I was going to agree wholeheartedly with both of you, especially with the notion of rationality as a tool, because to hear it framed on the internet, both by the atheist and the apologist side, most of the time, it's that rationality is some kind of synonym for objective truth. To the extent that you can say, if I'm rational, that means I have the correct facts. And that's not the role of rationality. Rationality is a process of getting logically true conclusions from sound premises. It's the process, and that goes back to your points on beauty, Julian. If there's no logical relationship between objective facts and beauty, there's no way to get to a beatific conclusion from an objective fact. So you have to start with the beauty, use a rational process, and get to the beauty. So beauty has to be injected from the beginning. So
I guess you could say the same thing about a thinker like what's his name? The youngest of the four horsemen, the atheists. What's his name?
Harris.
Yeah, Sam Harris. You already know that he's going to aim for, that he's aiming for some sort of well-being. He doesn't deduce well-being from the facts by using rationality. He starts with it, right? He starts with a sort of aesthetic preference for, being kind rather than being brutal. And then he gets there again using his rationality.
Right, and his inputs for that well-being argument are when drilled down to that point, he usually says things to the effect of it's obvious to the
Mm-hmm.
majority of sane people, and to the extent that that's true, and a lot of the times it is in his arguments, all he's saying is that the well-being as a matter of deductive fact is connected to our perception, our subjective perception of that well-being. He's not
Yep.
getting to well-being as a matter of ontology. All he's doing is finding a very coordinated, very scientific way of systematizing our subjective preferences and subjective sense of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that over criticism of someone like Sam Harris is also just once again, it's a distraction, because we have the same problem. Kierkegaard would suggest we have the same alienation from the absolute is never going to be something we're going to be able to articulate. So like, in a certain sense, admitting that is sets you off on a new path of not seeking validation from people. And ultimately, like, the idea of achieving power, the flip side of that is seeking validation, which is a very like insecure place. Like, if you're in the absolute in relation to the absolute, then you don't need anyone's validation of your position. You're in a certain sense humbly at the center of the universe, and someone else's affirmation of that is kind of meaningless, And so I think in general, the challenge is to admit that we'll never be able to articulate fully that axiom that is truth, but we can dramatize it, we can make poems that allude to it, but there's not really any use in seeking to rationalize the core or the still point or the creator. I mean, it's like, it is the unmanifest. It is that which came before time and space. It just feels to me like it's just a failed project to ask that question. And the thing that is useful, I guess, is to just admit that unless we are able to relate to that mystery, we're kind of going to be spinning circles or hurting ourselves or judging people. I just have been a recovering deconstructionist, where I just realized after probably 4 years, I just was deconstructing everyone else, but I had nothing affirmative to say. And setting off on the affirmative project has sent me mostly silence. And now I feel like I'm coming out of that silence barely, with a few things that I think I can affirm, but they're like the wildflower, it's not something I could ask someone to validate. The things that I affirm now are very kind of abstract, or not abstract, but meek and simple. My everyday life is not a grand proposition or an epic gesture.
Yes, and if I can jump off of that, that's Kierkegaard kind of has this notion. He doesn't elucidate it, but he definitely describes it, that every Christian is the only Christian in the world. And it's a lot like a relationship. I mean, when to any individual person, somebody else's relationship, somebody else's marriage, whatever, seems kind of absurd. Their rituals are absurd, the behavior is absurd, the language they employ is absurd, and you can describe another person's relationship in objective terms. It has properties, and you can make abstract descriptions of those properties, but none of that has anything to do with their relationship. Their relationship is intensely subjective, intensely personal, and it looks crazy and weird and awkward to anybody outside that relationship. And that's very much like the Christian's relationship with God. And so you can describe Christianity as a religion and Christendom as a community of people, but all you've done is describe a set of abstract properties about a group of people. You haven't described anybody's relationship or anybody's personal engagement with God. And for Kierkegaard, the personal relation of engagement with God at the individual particular level is the entire thing from the top to the bottom.
Excellent. Excellent. I agree with that. That's good. Well put.
Yeah, just thinking about this notion of deconstruction, and I don't know how well this is going to fit in, but I think Kierkegaard has given me as a Christian sort of resources about how to think about this question. I think the idea of faith and revelation is useful here, where Jarrod had this point about how you sort of need to start with beauty and then move towards rationality. I think that was what he said, right?
Well, the point that rationality is essentially a tool for connecting inputs to outputs. So so to the extent that you're ever going to end up with beauty, you had to start with beauty in the first place. So it's kind of a riff off of David Hume's is-ought gap, that you can never get something that's of category B out of something that's category A. You have to start with like and end up with like. Rationality is just the process that connects those two in a logically sound manner.
Yeah, I think Michael Polanyi has sort of a similar thing where he says, you can never. Rationality isn't sort of a way of objectively looking at the world and then gathering up all the facts you want and then constructing the rational system. Rationality sort of presupposes commitments or beliefs or faith or you need to start with some kind of a frame to look at the world, and then you can gather the facts you are noticing, and then you can start to construct something rational. And I think for the way I think about rationality as a Christian is that the most beautiful thing is God on the cross, and that is the starting point for my ethical reflection. Rationality begins with this upside down, powerless, crucified God, and then from that point, my thought proceeds. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I guess the notion of sort of beginning with faith, and then beginning with faith or beginning with revelation, and then moving into rationality is sort of a way of having aesthetics before you have rationality, and maybe that's one way to constrain the rationality being used in the surface of some kind of political project or some way of empowering yourself. And I think especially if this is what's so especially powerful about this idea of God the baby or God crucified is within this paradoxical image is this infinite powerlessness. Yeah, so this is one great battle cry against the fear that drives so much of apologetics, and it's one continuous tearing down of the powerful from their thrones.
Yeah, there's a book called Christ and the End of Meaning by a guy named Paul Hessert. And there's actually a free PDF online you can find. The book's out of circulation now, but essentially he was talking about how when we encounter God, it's actually a rupture in our meaning structure. And so the crucifixion is like what I would call a good piece of art does this. Like when I'm standing in front of an abstract piece of art, I sit there with the knowledge that someone put in many, many hours into this, right? In the case of Christ on the cross, his life blood, right? And then I'm like, okay, why is he why are they creating this piece of art? And then so my rational mind wakes up. Maybe if they're making a lot of money off of it, I can kind of rationalize, okay, well, they're making money. But as far as my friends are concerned who aren't making any money, if anything, jeopardizing the potential of making money in life, I'm just like shocked into this direct awareness of the individual's subjective experience. It's not, there's no rationality that can make sense of the effort that they've put into this piece. It's just a kind of it's a monument for the subjective. And so Christ crucified is really the, I guess, proclaiming that is the way that the subjective can be elevated over the objective. And the way that I kind of think of what Paul's project was is he's like an absurdist, you know, he's just parading around saying like, we preach Christ crucified, no power structure. There is no power structure. It's just direct subjectivity.
And Paul has this, I think he says it in Corinthians, where he says, I came to you knowing nothing but Christ crucified. You know, like
exactly.
There's the whole life and ministry of Christ, and he picks the one fact he picks, the one image he brings to the Corinthians is Christ crucified. Wow.
It just offends the mind. It just offends the rational mind. And it's incredibly subversive and awakening, and it doesn't leave you with much.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, I think spinning off the conversation you guys had last time, one thing that I thought was an important comment is my dad articulated pretty well, like Kierkegaard, elevating the phenomenological experience of Abraham walking up to Moriah, you know, the idea that we often read the story after knowing the end. And I think the same is done with Christ times 70. You know, it's like we know he raised from the dead, so we can just skip over those 3 holy days like it wasn't a big deal, you know, and if you enter into that direct experience, it's very intense. Like he was basically going to disappear into complete anonymity. Like he was going to be gone off the face of the planet, you know, never to be reflected on. He'd be a failed Messiah, essentially. But the thing that I think is really interesting to me about both of those stories, Abraham and Christ, is it's a net zero gain. So with Abraham, he had his son, the promise of inheritance, and then he's asked to sacrifice it. And it would be one thing if like he was also given a second thing, you know, if he was given something more than just getting his son back, we would have seen faith, the project of walking to Moriah, as in service of some goal or some objective gain. The same could be said with Christ, right? You have a guy who was alive in a human flesh. If he had returned after the resurrection and gone to Pontius Pilate and said, okay, I'm vindicated, I'm God. Or if he returned to the Pharisees, went in the synagogue and just preached and said, kill me again. I don't know. Like if he had been selfish and trying to seek validation, you might say he gained something from the resurrection. But really, he just reappeared as a man with his disciples and then disappeared. So there was this neutrality. And I think what that exposes in those two stories is that the goal was never faith in service of something higher. That the only way for me to actually make sense of Abraham's mentality is to see that he truly valued intimacy with God higher than his son. He was like, anything I can do to put myself in a posture of humility and vulnerability and subjective encounter, that's what I'm going to do, because that's truly what I see as the highest goal. If he sought out some higher goal, like I guess achieving world dominance or something, then that would be it'd be completely absurd. It's why for the most part, when I meditated on that story in Fear and Trembling, I didn't get anything out of it, because I was like, I don't see how Abraham could do that. I was taking my mentality of basically acting only in service of gain, and trying to put my mind in Abraham, and it just didn't work. But when I started to try and think about what kind of perspective actually wouldn't be necessarily afraid, that would walk humbly, it's one that truly values the moment to moment subjective experience over these objective ends, like a projection of the future or some potential gain, or even in Christ's position, most importantly, validation from other people.
Yeah, it's a wow. I'm not sure what I can add here. Yeah, Jarrod, can you add anything to this?
Well, yeah, that I agree with that, and the thoughts that came to mind is that's the nature of the Fear and Trembling title. That's where it comes from. The only appropriate response to have in that situation is fear and trembling. It's you described the instrumentality, a way of looking at the situation as if one thing had instrumental value to in bringing about another thing, and the thing about that is if we evaluate it that way, the attempted sacrifice of Abraham is not just absurd; it's immoral. It makes no sense, and it's positively evil. And I'm trying to remember where I was going to go with this, but when to instrumentalize it is to commit yourself to a conclusion. It's not to commit yourself to a conclusion in the sense that you've autonomously decided to make one, but you've said there is an answer to this situation in the objective world, and to the extent that X is efficient in bringing about Y, is in as an instrumental relationship, then whatever Y is, that commits me to a certain X. And that's again a very slavish, very mechanical form of engagement with the facts. It's definitely not an interpersonal engagement with God, and moreover, it's a form of engagement where the conclusion is already known in advance, and there's no personhood in a situation where the conclusion is known in advance. So that's again the role of faith in Christianity, is you're going on this journey with another person, with God, and the future emerges on a moment by moment, organically out of that relationship.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Did you have something to say, Julian?
Yeah. I was just thinking about the resurrection, and he made the point that sort of Christ sort of gives everything up and then sort of doesn't get any benefit in return. I'm thinking here, what Christ sort of renounces when he goes to the cross is precisely the wheel of history, precisely from a theological perspective, he renounces precisely his being, the Son of God who has control over the universe. This line, I could send angels to deliver me, but he renounces all that. He renounces any attempt to control the outcome of history. And then through the resurrection, the paradox is that through this renunciation, precisely by giving it up, he gains it all back again. And so I suppose the paradox I've been thinking a lot about is, when Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth, it's precisely the powerless who become the powerful. And it's such a mystery to me. But I think it's true, but I don't know exactly how. But I wonder if you could shed any light on that.
Well, I think that's what when I read the gospel in the beginning, I was more interested in Christ, but now I find myself more interested in the disciples. I feel like they're a little more relatable to me. And what I realize is you're basically capturing an evolution in the idea of what God is. So you have Peter, who's cutting the ear of the Pharisee off right at the end, right? He thinks that God is an instrument, to use Jarrod's point, that God is going to bring him something, specifically power in the world, right? And then God, in his grace through Christ or Jesus, dies and fails Peter, right? And so Peter's got nothing left. But then what's amazing is that when Jesus is resurrected, Peter realizes, oh, God was there all along. God wasn't the instrumental thing I made him to be. God was just a man willing to die. Like, and in a certain sense, when that occurs, you now have the realization that God is just a man. God is just something we encounter on an everyday, day-to-day experience. And it becomes much more accessible. And so through giving up that project of seeing God as somehow a vending machine or, you know, maybe even a messianic figure, we gain intimacy with God in a very immediate, meaningful way.
Yeah, and that curiously, that actually brings us back to the point about apologetics, because the God of the apologists is the God of classical monotheism. It's a very static, very conceptually easy to define God. It's an ontological fact of the universe that has this precise set of properties, and that's God. And there's no such thing as a person that's you know, a static fact of the universe with a precise set of properties. So there's something richly meaningful in that idea of Jesus as God and God as man. And just the person you're engaging with, the person you're going on this journey with. Because it's one thing to believe in a God if the God is the God of classical monotheism. Anybody can do that. It's a whole nother thing to have a relationship with a person.
And to value your moment-to-moment experience as somehow containing the presence of God is to somehow sacrifice the necessity to put instrumental value on everything. Like your grandmother who's dying. It's like, well, talking to my grandma's not getting me anywhere, or God forbid, like taking care of her, that's getting you nowhere, you know, in an instrumental way. But if you can kind of see within her God, then you truly believe that. If you can truly believe that the lily of the field is more beautiful than Solomon in all his glory, that your direct experience is somehow, uncomparably valuable, then you've hit the cosmic lottery. You have a front row ticket to the universe, you know, but you're never going to be able to prove that to anyone. And so you're alienated, and yet you've simultaneously gained the universe. You've sold everything you have, and yet you've bought the pearl of great price. But you can't validate it. You can't seek affirmation. You just experience the wildflowers, and I guess you praise God, and you probably write poetry or talk with your friends about it, but it's not really an argument you can make.
It's choosing to live a life of means without an end, instead of focusing on the end. And the end will come. The end is connected to the means, but you're not focusing on that. You're choosing the means in choosing to live and comport yourself with that form of engagement.
And that reminds me of the guy in Fear and Trembling that he calls the Knight of Faith, is the guy who's just walking home to eat pie with his mother or with his wife. And if she makes the pie, he'll be happy. It's like he just kind of shows how simple you become. It's you stepped outside of this epic journey almost, and you're just a guy walking home now.
Wow. Yeah. It seems like Kierkegaard, even for Kierkegaard, someone like the monk who, there's one of my favorite theologians is Stanley Hauerwas, and he has this line about, living a life that is unintelligible unless the God Christians claim to worship isn't real or something like that. And the idea there is sort of to live absurd life, sort of the monk who lives this celibate life, serving others in poverty. But Kierkegaard seems to be saying that even is a temptation, because precisely for the point you're making here, Kierkegaard somehow goes even beyond the monk. He sort of even goes beyond the need to live this profoundly celibate life and somehow to return to renounce everything, but then to return to reality and to delight in it for what it is. That's such a beautiful image. Wow.
And what's interesting is that when you commit yourself to an end, when you have a goal in mind, there's two interesting things that's true of that goal. One, it's static, it's objective, it's unmoving. And I actually forgot where I was going with this, but it's static, it's objective, it's unmoving, and it's your primary focus of concern. So if you think of whatever a person's God is their primary focus of concern, that is now your God. Your God is static, impersonal, and your primary focus of concern. In this case, your God is an idol. That's a very classic way of understanding idolatry, is setting yourself on a mission to bring about some end. And that's true even if your end is the monastic life, just as you were saying, Julian. So you've no less created an idol out of monasticism.
I think that the 3 days that Christ spent in the grave were meant as a abolishment of the idol they had made out of him. So they had 3 days to think about who Jesus was.
Mm-hmm.
And that turns out to be someone different than they thought he was, even though they were the most, they were the closest to him. And I think that Christians, especially Christians that find themselves to be bound up in the intellectual aspects of faith, unlike the man who's strolling home from dinner, or strolling home to dinner, or maybe not. Like him, they're bound up with these intellectual pursuits instead of actually bound up in living out their faith. It'd be well, I think, for I'm pointing at myself right now, of course, but to meditate on those 3 days for one. There's some excellent, or I don't know if I will say excellent. There's some art that people have made over the years, not recently, but a couple hundred years ago or so. During the Renaissance, they had many painters painted pictures of Christ in the tomb, and one of them is really good. Yeah, I'll just actually post a link to it here. It's very good because it shows how dead he was. That sounds bizarre, but it shows that he was really truly dead. So their God was dead. The God that they thought was going to save them from the political oppression of the Romans was gone, and they had to think about who he really was, like I mentioned. And so, two things to meditate on for the intellectually predisposed Christian: the death of God, literally, and also the choice of Abraham, because it like we mentioned already, it is an immoral. Technically, it's an immoral choice.
I've got this idea spinning around my head. This is going to launch this into a different direction, but I hope it's not too weird. And that is well, first off, we hold this precious scripture and the way these stories lay themselves out for us, the way we've been talking about them. And yet there's a kind of grand irony that that I think Kierkegaard kind of, for me, a little bit kind of recovers us from, which is perhaps unfortunately the history of Christianity itself. If you look at that moment that Kevin talked about, that Peter in the garden, and the kind of obvious fact that that was a misinterpretation of what Christ was up to, and how we've now kind of see that story as a way into what this really means. But then, just a few hundred years later, you've got Constantine, raising the sword in the name of the cross, and then that being a moment in which Christianity in the world, the worldly church, is launched onto history, at least one way of framing that. And then you've got the Trail of Tears that you can paint that that history. It's a mixed bag, and we can say that out loud. But there's a lot of effort through the church to become the dominant force in history in a worldly sense, and that that feels like nothing different than that impulse that Peter had in the garden. And so for me, like Kierkegaard, as I talked to you about last time, Julian, Kierkegaard reopens the possibility for there to be this kind of more direct and personal reality of Christianity, and I don't know where those thoughts take us. I know this jumps us into a little bit of a different world, but it was the thought that was going on in my head.
I have a few things to say. First of all, I'll get back to what you were saying, Jim, but just wanted to throw in one more comment on, I think, what Robert and Kevin were saying. I guess for sort of the more intellectually inclined Christians, it's so often easy to sort of get discouraged with the reality of what the church is and how pathetic everything is, and I suppose the vision that Kevin paints for us sort of allows us to renounce the need to have the perfect church, or to have the perfect reality. Goodness, where did everyone go? Let me pause. To have the perfect reality. Yeah, I suppose it's just being able to live in the reality, and live in the reality as for what it is, and to love the reality for what it is, and not feel the need to always change people to conform to your own image. That's such a fundamental thing for me, which I don't live up to at all. And now as to what Jim was saying, about Christianity sort of becoming obsessed with its own worldly power. I'm reading a book right now called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, and that's just an incredible book for me, because the point the author makes is that sort of asks the question, how is it that this little cult that starts out around Jesus with just a few followers could by the 4th century become the religion of the empire? And then he sort of lays out some facts about how the church engaged in mission. He points out, for example, that the early Christians actually weren't very active in sharing the gospel or sharing their faith with others. They didn't invite outsiders into their church as sort of a way of sort of showing the beauty of the faith. They didn't instruct catechumens to, promoting mission wasn't part of what they instructed catechumens to do. and he points out other observations like that. So the church wasn't sort of involved in this sort of explicit missional missional. It wasn't sort of actively trying to get people to join the church by sort of saying, this is the gospel, believe it and join. Well, he makes the point that what they did instead was what he describes as a patient ferment, which is instead an emphasis on living in a way that is radically different to the mainstream of Roman society, and through that lifestyle to draw people in. And so there was a much bigger emphasis on living faithfully, and a much more inward emphasis on forming people in the faith. And he also makes the point that there were up to the 4th century, I think, there were 3 treatises on the virtue of patience and none on mission or anything like that. And so I suppose the virtue of patience is so essential here. How you can just patiently live your life as a Christian and sort of let time be greater than space, and give up the need, and with this virtue of patience, you give up the need to control the outcome. I hope that, does that make any sense?
Yeah, to let yourself be known by your fruits. If you do that, you don't need to tell people who you are. So
it's very true. There's I don't know if anyone has this experience, but there is a danger actually the other way too, where so my church tends to emphasize living out your faith, and that is done as a form of evangelism. So we don't do as much, what would you call it, community outreach or whatever, or more explicitly evangelical style outreach. It's just like, you do service work for the community, but you don't say, we're doing this, hey, come join our church. It's more like, here we are, we're working, trying to do good things, right? But then it can become, the danger becomes a refusal to do anything that seems like it might be explicitly overtly Christian, even evangelizing. That's probably a unique thing for my church, but I found that does happen sometimes. So.
Yeah, that touches on Julian's point about beauty. I mean, if you make a beautiful song, you don't need to convince somebody to appreciate it. The
Exactly.
beauty of the song does that intrinsically.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Jim, I guess it seemed like you guys dropped off for a second there. And I guess the point we were essentially making is the virtue of patience as an antidote to the need to control, right? So in the book I'm reading right now called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, the author essentially makes the point that, what Constantine represents is the triumph of impatience over patience, and I think Kierkegaard has this too in his attack upon Christendom, where he says, the triumphant church has seized what is supposed to be in the future and tries to sort of have it now. So this vision of just living patiently and leaving things up to God, I guess, is much more powerless.
Yeah, I guess the other way I would approach that, we lost our internet connection there for a minute, so we took us a second to get back. But yeah, I think the fascinating thing is how the the scriptures and the kind of the deeper story seems to still perpetuate itself through history, such that it lands in our lap all these centuries later, despite the fact that the worldly manifestation of even that very narrative, ultimately manifests itself in what you would ultimately expect in a fallen world, as exactly what you're talking about, being impatient and imagining it in this way of triumphalism, or all the different ways in which it ultimately manifests itself corruptly in the real world. Not unique to Christianity. That's not unique to Christianity. It's the same in non-Christian manifestations of humanity's efforts to control.
Mm-hmm. And is there any virtue more important for today than patience?
Mm-hmm.
And any virtue under a more direct assault than patience, I should add, because what is our whole internet, social media culture forming us into, if not impatience?
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Fear and Trembling, which is, "The night of faith to the onlooker seems to have almost an infinite procrastination." Or do you remember that quote? Like, infinite procrastination. It's like, what is he trying to accomplish here? It's I could maybe even find it, but because I underlined it a number of times, but.
Yeah, it's exactly, it's, and the paradox for me is so often giving up on the result actually is the only way to get the result. And I think of this, people have made this point with regards to the whole argument over faith and over works and grace, and people sometimes make the point that it's only when you stop trying to be a proper Christian, or trying to live up to what Jesus calls you to do, and sort of accept the fact that you're radically saved by grace, it's only then that you can actually start to live that way. It's only when you sort of give up the need to control who you are and what you live out, which isn't something I've personally experienced, but people tell me it's true.
Or also give up the project of formulating in your head some correct image of what God is, or who God is, or how what the rules are, or how it's supposed to be pictured, or what my experience of that is supposed to be. I'm supposed to have some experience like someone else describes for me. All of those things perhaps need to be given up.
Yeah, and to touch on what Julian was saying, this notion of impatience seems to imply that the impatient Christian is longing for the kingdom, but they'd like the kingdom to manifest now. But you look at real world examples of that. Constantine, for example, it's not like Constantinian Rome was a model of kingdom mindedness. So this impatience seems to be a cover for just a blatant worldly power grab. It's completely contrary to not only the biblical understanding of power, but to biblical ideals. So it's not simply that impatience is intrinsically a problem because it's impatient. It's that impatience necessarily causes one to pursue things that are anti-Christian.
I think, wow, that's a good point. I think that's why uncertainty and paradox are so central to Kierkegaard too, because for him, once you start to sort of solidify, I don't want to go too. I suppose once you sort of start to solidify what you think everyone should be like, or who you, or if you think you have sort of this grasp on God, that is also tied up with this impatience, because, you know, as Paul says, we see only darkly. So I suppose this sort of grasping on to this sort of arriving at the end of the journey, but refusing to acknowledge that you are still on the journey, and all of the different ways that manifests are all expressions of impatience, and will ultimately lead to destructive outcomes, I think. So there always needs to be this tension between the now and the not yet. So this sort of sense that, you know, you have chosen the path that you're going to follow as a Christian, and that you have some idea of where you're headed, but you always have to be humble about, you know, who you are, what you're headed towards, and what your conception is of that. And so there always needs to be this tension between what you have solid and what you're sort of, what you can't grasp. And once you try to grasp too much, that's a move of impatience, and it's horrible.
I think impatience is also a sign of, or a symptom of, a sense of false security. So we have all of these things that, you know, we talked about them distracting us as well, but we just have all of these things, even our structures that we build, our theological structures where we try to define God. That is, we try to trap God in a way so that we can exert some sense of control over him, and therefore gain some security for ourselves. And I think that for a lot of people, what's needed is the way to a position where you can make the movement of faith is what's needed is a shock. And but for others, I think that the shock is delivered. What would I say? It's delivered in advance, or it's delivered by nature, in a sense, where in Fear and Trembling he talks about nature's like he actually uses Gloucester from Richard III as an example. And Gloucester was a very deformed man. He was a hunchback, and he said, you know, he went on and on about how he was deformed and he couldn't live a normal life, and that for Kierkegaard, that was a shortcut to the religious. So the direct quote is that he says, "Such natures are aboriginally in the paradox, and they are by no means less perfect than others. It is only that they are either damned in the demonic paradox or delivered in the divine." And he goes on from there. But basically what he's saying is, what's needed is a shock, and if you're, in a sense, if you're lucky, you are already in the position without having to receive it artificially or something like that. And those who are in that position, aboriginally, they are either they basically have two routes they can go. They're either damned in the demonic in a defiant position, or a defiant stance on their own position in regards to God, or they're saved by the divine. That is, they take up the right stance in relation to God. So that was really interesting.
I can add too some things here. You know, this brings me to another critique of apologetics. The reason why it's almost impossible for someone like, let's use the archetype here, Sam Harris, to come to faith, and the reason the dialogue or the debate with the apologists is so fruitless, is because both of them are operating from the sense of certainty, of we know what the truth is, and both of them are in no position to recognize that uncertainty is at the center of the religious life. And like Robert just said, you know, these people don't need rational arguments. They need a shock out of that whole way of thinking. And it just reminds me of Jesus saying, the poor and the destitute are the closest to the kingdom of God, because these are the people who are the most powerless and have the least to lose. And for so many of us, what needs to happen before we can ever truly enter into the religious life is for us to deconstruct all of the idols and the things we are holding on to, and the power and all of the mammon, essentially. All of that has to be deconstructed before we can ever arrive at faith.
Yeah, it seems to me that there's kind of a competing worldviews at play. One is the comparable value, so the amount of money you have in the bank account, that makes the rich man winning in this game. Anything that's has a metric or can be kind of reduced to numbers, I guess, or even communicated. There's this one paradigm that's communicable value. And then there's the infinite value, the eternal, or the lily of the field, once again, where it's like just abundance of, like, if God is truly present to us right now, that statement is that the highest goal, the greatest aim we could have is here now, and it's equally available. And to your point, Julian, the person who's poor in this metric system is going to be looking for an alternative. They're going to be like, well, I'm not winning the game over here. Is there an option? And Christ kind of can invite them out of their slavery to this oppressive system of comparative value. But the rich young ruler is going to have a hard time because he's winning. Even though if you were to put the metric of the infinite next to the small little comparison, it'd be like off the chart, he is winning in his own paradigm. And so if he surrenders this comparative paradigm, he's having to let go of a winning hand, whereas the impoverished person has very little to lose. So it's all about you still have to get off of that paradigm. And I think the victim mentality is a problem, because it's basically saying that the rich people in power, or the people in power in general, it's validating that structure of belief, which is that there is this comparable, measurable value in the human experience. And so if you say you're losing in that, you're actually edifying or reinforcing that structure. So that's a problem too. But to appreciate the lily in its glory, this everyday, accessible, infinite beauty, you have to kind of be willing to step off of that game of comparison.
Yeah. Jarrod and I were talking about this too. The point of victim mentality. I think what sometimes ends up happening there is you're still holding on to this paradigm of power, where you're trying to empower yourself, but the hierarchy of the richest or whatever has suddenly been flipped on its head, and now the poor people are just on the top of the power hierarchy. So you're still you've empowered the poor, but in a sense you've made them worse off, right? In a sort of material sense, you've given them the benefits of being in power, but in the spiritual sense, you've put them into the place of they're sort of
you've moved them further from grace.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at that point, to Julian's point, that's exactly what Nietzsche was complaining about in the genealogy of morals. He was complaining that what Christianity had done was simply flipped it. Flipped the structure of morality, so that the meek will literally inherit the earth, in the sense that they will take the place of the powerful, right? And that, just like you said, just is obviously a negative when it comes to Christianity, because if they simply take the place, like literally take their place, they become the rich man, and then you have the same problem all over again, and they have just as much trouble as the original rich man in getting through the eye of the needle, right?
You know, one thing that I thought was interesting, I've commented on this before, is that Nietzsche's point is that the entire Christian value set, and Christian's ethical language is modeled on weakness, on powerlessness, humility, servitude, etc. So we live in an interesting time now where Christians have assumed power. They've taken they've taken worldly power by the horns, and it's always struck me how incredibly awkward it is as Christians try to wield power using the language of powerlessness, because that's the language they have, and it's awkward, it's bumbling buffoonery, and it's obviously so. So that conflict is always, I find that interesting on a regular basis, you know, just watching the news.
It's interesting.
Yeah, these are all good points. I would like to just throw out kind of applause to Julian for putting this together. This has really worked pretty well, particularly the last two conversations has really enriched my engagement with Kierkegaard again in a way that I really appreciate. Jarrod has helped as well. And now we got the real academic expert, Robert, down there. And
yeah, right.
Kev joined in as well. So this has been really great, and I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Kevin, you added so much to the conversation, and Jarrod, as always, is just brilliant. So, yeah, I'm really glad we got you guys together. We should wrap it up because we've been going for almost 2 hours, and we could probably go another hour, but yeah. So thanks everyone for being here. This has been great.
Yeah, this was great.
Guys.